Tanks in cinema, as before, and at present remain a serious problem for filmmakers. To get the old original equipment every year is becoming more and more difficult, and there is incredibly little of it. Most often, the only way to portray the desired tank is to weld Harkturni sheets of metal, various props, and hope that the result will be similar to the original. Some specialists have so authentic copies of historical models that it is necessary to consider them almost under a magnifying glass, while others can simply draw the corresponding identification marks and pretend that it is so and necessary. I have already told about it in my previous video about tanks in cinema, and in this video I will do approximately the same thing, but a little go beyond the American and domestic cinema, and touch on a much wider geography of world military cinematography. And we'll start with the popular Cold War film Red Dawn '84. The film is the most overblown propaganda film that was made on the other side of the ocean. Compared to it, Three Rimbaud will seem like an epic saga. In short, the Communist Soviets and the Cubans have swarmed all over the United States. Of course, with the usual denounced anger, then proceeded to clean up the territories, not from the army, but from the population. Soviet troops dressed, well, at best, in Civil War garb. In short, the film in the spirit of the time. And it is clear to throw the American landing without the Soviet techniques, it is impossible. I will run ahead and say that there is not a single real sample of Soviet equipment in the film. But the Americans approached the recreation of Soviet samples of equipment very seriously. As the main argument of the Soviet army is presented T-72, or maybe even T-64. As it is not very well made, tank gives not very well, and the Soviet undercarriage, because the basis for the tank was an American tractor M8, which was produced from 1950 to 1955. This tractor was designed by extending the chassis of the American light tank M41 Walker Bulldog, and used for towing heavy guns or for transporting shells. Air-cooled petrol engine Continental with 6 cylinders was located, of course, at the front. So the internal layout of the Li T-72 was not simple. The turret was made of metal, and the gun barrel was made of aluminum and fiberglass. By the way, the T-72 was very successful and was filmed in many American films where the Soviet Army was represented, such as Short Circuit 1986, The Fourth War 1990, in the already mentioned Rambo 3, and a couple of other not very famous films and TV series. Also in the frame, Flash's incredibly cool-made BRDMs, made them, by the way, as many as 4 pieces. As you can see on the photo of models on the car park of the Soviet Navy, on the territory of the film site, BRDM is comparable in size to Jeeps, and accordingly, smaller and lower than the original. The reason for the low height was the base on which these BRDMs were created, namely Dodge M37. It is well noticeable on the running gear. Pseudo-BRDMs were filmed, of course, in other films as well. Well, if the main Soviet force in the film was the airborne troops, there was no way to do without the BMB. It turned out to be not so good, due to the fact that the base for the creation served as a rather high M113, and that it would be a little more similar to the BMD drew the emblem of the airborne forces. The film did not do without APCs. American filmmakers, for an example, took the Soviet BMP-60BP, a long time looking for a chassis on what can be welded Soviet transporter, and found the basis was a rare 4-axle truck REO XM 453E3. BTR turned out to be very similar. The differences are noticeable only in the running gear, yet the American tractor has pairs of axles located in a different way from BMP-60. And yes, the product is also in consequence roamed through films with different budgets, ranging from Rambo 3, ending with the British series Curfew as early as 2019 release. In the film, practically from scratch created in Shilka, it seems that the base was the same tractor M8. Glimmer 45mm cannons on the basis of German guns, 40mm anti-aircraft gun Bofors plays the role of the Soviet K-61. Such in the film a lot, Red Dawn has set a great tone of the industry how to approach the creation of war technique. Yes, not always perfect, but quite not bad. But in another equally American Cold War film called Red Scorpion with Soviet technology is all very bad. The film is beautiful if only because in the main role Dolph Lundgren plays Nikolai, or I am Russian Spetsnaz. Nikolai Rodchenko is one of the most executive soldiers in the service of the Soviet leadership. That is why he is sent to one of the African states with the task to find among the inhabitants of the rebel leader. Only on arrival at the place of destination, Nikolai realized that he had become a tool in the hands of scoundrels, and he goes over to the side of the locals. Since the film was shot in South Africa, all the Reds drive right-hand drive cars, are Land Rovers, Toyotas, various armored cars like Caspier, even motorbikes have a sidecar on the left. In the film, only 5 Soviet vehicles is UAZ-469, which for the whole film does not get not one bullet, unlike the rest of the cars that are destroyed in a puff and sprays it, an understandable 88 year at the time. Authentic UAZ to get is not so easy. Gaz-66 Kung at the Resistance, which does not go, and Gaz-66 flatbed on the basis of the Soviets also as an exhibit, and a super novelty in the field of armament for the end of the 80s. Years tank T-34, tank T-34-85. The scriptwriters thought that in 1985, the Soviet Army in the first echelon should go T-34. But this is just the beginning, as probably the Soviet APC took wheeled BMP South African production called Ratel. With it did not do anything at all, red star on the sides and a large emblem of the Soviet airborne troops, especially pleased with the machine gun Browning M1919A4. Even more mysterious actor in the face of 3-axle truck also plays the role of something Soviet. The fact that it again tells us the emblem of the airborne troops. Well, and as a highlight, the filmmakers really wanted to show the Soviet BM-21 Grad. They put 10 water pipes welded together on the South African truck Samuel 20 and decided to end it there. It was supposed to be a BM-21, but it turned out to be a Chinese salute. With small arms also a big trouble. In the arms of the Soviets and their friends, Hungarian clones AK AMD-65, Israeli Galil RPG-7 shoots one tube without missiles. Separately, it is worth to stop on the helicopter, like Mi-24, which is equipped with a multi-barrel machine gun General Electric M134. It looks very remotely like a real Mi-24, which is not surprising. For the film, it is made from a Sikorsky S-62 helicopter, which was a common practice for film shootings in the old days. The same helicopter was used in the films Bulletproof, 1988, and Braddock, The Missing 3, 1988. A little bit away from the Cold War and talk about earlier events in history, namely the Second World War. In 1970, a joint American-German film, The Last Escape, was released. In short, the end of the Second World War. Allied troops penetrate a protected German missile base and kidnap rocket scientist Dr. von Heinken. Both the Germans and the Russians, who want to get their hands on the doctor, give chase. A group of Americans paratroop in SS uniforms and run to get the doctor. And they all end up running away from the Germans for almost the entire film in German trucks from the 1950s. But all the while, there are Ruski riding around somewhere in the background who are also eager to capture the doctor. For this purpose, they have mysteriously sent a whole tank column to the German rear. And that tank column is definitely worthy of our attention. At first glance on the angular parts of the turret, I would say that in front of us are trying to depict German tanks. But no, the tanks depict Soviet tankers, and big red stars exactly develop all doubts. And gorgeous onboard numbers, U9, A2, FV18, put a bold point in the belonging of the techniques. The base of the tank served as an American M41 Walker Bulldog. The turret was covered with sheets of metal, and it turned out to say not very plausible. Interesting is also a machine gun that was installed on the tank, approached the issue responsibly. At first glance, it seems that in front of us, tank DT, but in '70 to get such a weapon to the American filmmakers was clearly difficult. They took aviation machine gun, Lewis, a little bit of it, Podsha manual, and it turned out to be very similar to the tank DT. Another American film about the Second World War called Tobruk 67 tells us that the speech will be about the African theater of military operations. The film is about a reconnaissance and sabotage group of the British military who, with the help of German Jews, try to deprive Rommel's army in Africa of fuel. In the previous video, I told about the film Patton, where German tanks were represented by American M48 Patton. In this film, decided to follow a similar path. M48 in the beginning of the film presented as Italian tanks in Africa, and near the end of the tanks played the role of German panzers. In the first case, Italian flag. In the second case, Balkenkreuz, as the German half-track equipment took on the role of the American armored personnel carrier M3, as make-up onboard crosses and sand paint. Not going far from Tobruk, literally in 3 years after the previous picture, Italians have decided to shoot the film here as German Technik cinephiles have taken the real Frankenstein. From the first seconds of film, we are met by tank M4 FL-10. The tank is a deep modernization of the American medium tank M4 Sherman, using elements of the French light tank AMX-13, designed and made in France by Batignolles Chatillon on the order of Egypt in the middle of 1950. So the Italians decided that a tank with an American base, French head, designed for the Egyptians, will perfectly fit as a German tank. The cross is drawn. What questions can there be? Italians made quite a lot of war films, still, as they did not participate in the war, but had time to fight with almost everyone. By the way, you know that the Italians, even with the Japanese in World War II, managed to fight in China. The story is very cool. If you are interested, write in the comments. In the film of the 60s called All at Home Events, about how in September 1943, after Marshal Badoglio announces the withdrawal of Italy from the war, Italy is under German occupation, and Italian soldiers, tired of army life, run away to their homes. So in the beginning of the film, we are shown a couple of German Panthers. There are no questions. Silhouettes of the German tank are well recognized, but let's not be snobs, but the lower frontal detail made very large, and the resulting clearance is not a tank. All this was done in order to hide the wheels under the tank. Yes, the filmmakers apparently took a 2-axle vehicle on, which they have already installed the finished body of the Panther. In one of the moments when the tank is turned to the viewer's stern, clearly visible wheelbase product. But this is not all interesting products of this film. Somehow at the end of the film appears this, the so-called German Panzer, on the chassis of the American M5 high-speed tractor. Covered the body of the Caterpillar tractor with plywood and installed a fake turret. It's hard to say why the same wheeled pseudo-Panthers were not used in the final part of the film, because the tractor PZ appears in the frame only for 1 to 2 tenths of seconds, but it seems there was some explanation. By the way, the use of wheeled vehicles as a base for film tanks in the middle of the 20th century was quite a common theme. In one German film called Die Brücke from 1959, the film won an Oscar for Best Foreign Film, a Golden Globe, and it was even shown in Soviet cinemas. Hitler's army suffers defeat after defeat. Soon American troops may be in the city. In such a situation, the Nazis go to extreme measures, replenishing their reserves with schoolchildren taken directly from their desks. And these schoolchildren are the last obstacle before the advancing American troops. In the last episodes of the film, the American army, with the support of Shermans, advances on the positions of the main characters. Their extra width is due to the wheel undercarriage, which is perfectly visible. In the first 2 tanks made undercarriage that imitates the movement of tracks. The third has a tracked undercarriage, does not even touch the surface, just the product moves on wheels, and that they would not be very conspicuous space under the bottom closed shield. I am sure that many may have the opinion that crookedly made tanks is an attribute of purely old cinema. On the one hand, I can agree with you. In modern films, tanks actors are not often found, but these cases are still present. In the American, clearly not the best war film called Company of Heroes, found money for good actors. But when it came time to spend on tanks, apparently the money ran out. As a German Panzer, we are presented this. I think it is not worth saying what tank took as a basis. The question is only one: why it was necessary to do it this way? Why these angular additions near the mast of the gun and in the stern of the turret? In this case, it would be very logical to draw only German Balkenkreuz. During the Second World War, Germans understandably captured Soviet tanks and used them for their own purposes. T-34 was not an exception. Germans even modernized Soviet tanks for their needs. For example, captured T-34 76 were even equipped with German commanders' turrets. Or here is a photo of captured 85 tank somewhere in Hungary, or here in the Finnish army. Of course, the participation of T-34 on the Western Front was very limited, rather even sporadic, but a couple of photos with trophy T-34 in France can be found. So in this film, it would be better to do nothing at all. Neatly scripted hint that it is a trophy tank and limited to German identification marks, or so, and money spent on it, bad Panzer and T-34 incomprehensible. In another little-known Yugoslavian film, T-34 also play the role of a German tanks. In general, T-34 very often make up under the Panzers. It is engaged in both domestic and foreign cinema. So the film The Only Road 1975 was no exception. For 1975, the tank made not bad, but clearly not without joints. The tank, with the help of plywood sheets, made square similarly sheathed and turret. First of all, the absence of a muzzle brake, typical for the depicted tank. Well and clearly the Yugoslavs overdid it with the observation tank driver hole, turning it into a real vent the size of half of the body. Well, and the place of the machine gunner clearly differs from the original. Similar to this copy-made Tiger, and in another film from the Balkans, Battle on Neretva. The film is in the spirit of the Yugoslav cinema of that time, about how partisans communists fight in a puff of dust and ashes crowds of Germans, Italians, and other bad guys. All this army uses not a small list of tanks, and T-34 in the film are presented as completely rebuilt, and in general, almost unchanged. The film also shows the multipolarity of Bras Tito's policy in the post-war period. The appearance of American Shermans with German crosses together with 34-85 perfectly shows it. But in addition to equipment from different opposing blocs, military from the Balkans created their own tanks, which was later used for their own purposes, and domestic filmmakers. In the series Unconquered City 1981, German Panzer was made on the basis of Yugoslavian armored personnel carrier M60. Clearly noticeable disproportion, but the finished product looks more than good and negative emotions do not cause. Later Yugoslavs to represent the Germans used, and the Soviet BRDM-2 and American M36 Jackson. Yugoslavian cinema is not at all that I have watched to find tank actors. I think I've lost my mind, but I've reached Indian cinema, and which you will definitely like. In 2015, the Indians decide to make their own World War II film. As you know, the widespread legend that philosopher Mahatma Gandhi achieved Indian independence through non-violence and moral authority is beautiful but far from reality. Apart from Gandhi, the idea of independence was shared by 2 million Indian war veterans who fought on the side of Britain. Indians had to meet in battles with all the Axis countries, with the Germans in France, with the Italians in Africa, and the Japanese in Burma. So in the film, under the promising title, Fence 2015, as far as I understand the plot of the film, 2 Hindu brothers go to the British Army to fight with the German troops, and here begins the most interesting thing. Hindus, on some unknown occasion, are dressed in Soviet uniform, with military signs of Great Britain, wear Soviet helmets. In the background are Kamikaze fueling trucks, and a lot of other secular equipment. And moreover, armed with Soviet weapons. I first thought that I misunderstood something in the story, because the film is not in English. Here in the picture it seems rather that the Indians are fighting on the side of the Soviet army. But then the next frame on the Soviet truck is a British flag, and in the camp itself is painted Union Jack. And further we see German counterattack. At least Germans are not in Soviet uniform, but they look not as soldiers as if a bunch of prisoners of war